Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming so early. This series is called Beyond the Podium. I particularly like this title because there's the podium and I'm beyond it. Some speakers you will find hide behind the podium, literally, especially if they're vertically challenged. When I started putting this talk together, there was so much information, I couldn't do it justice in one presentation. I had to divide it in two. So here you are for part one. And that's my name up there. Over on the left is my logo, and over on the right, Beyond the Podium. This is me. I am retired. Who is retired? Who is not retired? Why not? It's so much fun. I was a senior research scientist in the field of health physics. Nobody knows what that is unless they worked in it. I've published over 200 papers in the peer-reviewed literature, so I've added knowledge to the human knowledge domain. In the last phase of my work, it was mostly emergency response. I have been past president of the Canadian Radiation Protection Association, not once but twice. I'm still debating whether the second time was bravery or stupidity. I'm still on the fence about that. The FHPS is I am a fellow of the Health Physics Society. I am Canadian, so that is very unusual. In fact, I am the only living Canadian that is part of the Fellowship of the Health Physics Society. Dogs, you will understand later. Yes, that's a hook. And finally, I am a super geek. Okay, enough of that, enough of me. I always like to begin with something humorous at the beginning of my presentations. Here's today's offering. I mean, maybe they had a bad night when they were painting the road, who knows? But there you go. And each one of these, I have a different picture for each one of my talks. Okay, what are we doing? What's the scope? Part one, I've listed up here. We're going to go from 1530 up to about 1905. Up to the early US presence in the Panama Canal, and some interesting facts. That's the scope of part one. That's what you're here for. Part two, then, we're going to go from 1905 up to the present time, and that's really when the US completed the canal, and also when the canal was handed over to Panama. We will talk about the new locks, and we'll have more interesting facts about the canal. Okay, this is the beginning. So the first person that really saw the Pacific is Balboa. You might recognize his name as being one of the places here in Panama. He was the first to see the East Pacific. He crossed over the isthmus. He dragged his ships over. That was the only way to do it. He created a trail in order to do that. And that trail that he created has long since gone. It was abandoned when the original Panama City was created, so there's nothing really left of that. In 1515, Captain Guzman found this trail. This is the Camino Trail, and that had been in use for centuries by the natives in the area. It was developed by the Spanish, and of course in those days the Spanish were very equitable about how they constructed things. They made the locals slaves and they made them work, so that's how that was done. They used about 4,000 captured natives to do this. And then finally, the 1533, we have the Las Cruces Trail that was built, enabling people to go from the Atlantic side to the Pacific side, and they would carry things. This map here shows you the trails as they developed. It's color coded. I've got the legend up there. And so where are we? There we go. Those are the trails there. You see there's a red one up there, a purple one, a blue one down here, there's a green one, and there's another one down there. So those are the trails that had been created. And Panama itself, the original Panama, got destroyed by Henry Morgan, the pirate, in 1671. So the ruins are still there. Now, King Charles I of Spain, also the Holy Roman Emperor, wanted to create a shortcut. So he thought, yes, maybe we can build something to get ships through instead of moving them over land, which is the way they had to do it. So the first step, of course, is to survey it, see what you can do. They draw up the plans in the mid-1500s, and it was, in the governor's opinion at that time, the governor who was ruling that area, an impossible task. And indeed, it did prove to be impossible up to the point where it did not become impossible anymore. But that's centuries later. Typical flattery here from somebody. If there are mountains, there are also hands. To a king of Spain with the wealth of the Indies at his command, when the object to be attained is the spice trade, what is possible is easy. And of course the king was swayed by flattery like this and tried to move forward on it. It failed. We now move up to the 18th century, and Britannia, who rules the waves, also wanted to do the same thing. And they wanted to make a connection so they could get to the Far East. They secured treaties, they even went ahead and were ready to move forward on that. They were dealing with a country called Nueva Granada, that's Colombia and Panama. And finally they figured out that's too expensive, so that didn't go anywhere. What's the next step? Well, we have surveys that were done in 1850 looking at a different route. And you may have heard of the Nicaragua route. There was a Chinese billionaire that was actually going to build this some years ago, but he went bankrupt and that failed. We're looking at Nicaragua here, as you can see in the pictures, and this is where the canal was thought to be a good place to put it. Now remember the Nicaragua route. We'll come back to that when we get to the American involvement. There was a treaty between the USA and Great Britain, and that treaty said nobody's going to build anything without either one of them's permission. So that kind of stalled things. And the USA in those days, is shown in the map there, it looks a bit different from what you're familiar with today. As you can see, some large territories there. And one of them, of course, was Mexican country, which is this one here, the Mexican cession. 1875, we have another survey looking at the Panama Canal route. That's too expensive. That's going to be too difficult. So they proposed, again, going through Nicaragua. They were going to use 12 blocks. They were going to use the existing lake that you see there. They were going to put locks where the arrow is, and they were going to put more rocks there, and they were going to have themselves a nice canal. So that was the American idea, to do that. France now gets into the game, and they want to build a railroad. And they entered into agreement with Nueva Granada again, Colombia and Panama, and they're going to build a railroad. That, unfortunately, never started. So that railroad fell through from France. But the French, of course, are instrumental in beginning the project that we're talking about, and we'll get to that soon. Now, the Panama Railroad Company did actually begin. William Aspinwall, Colon's name originally was Aspinwall, named after him, began the Panama Canal Railroad. They began construction in 1850, and they'd finished 8 miles 2 years later. And it's not until 1855 they get that first train going across from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And as you can see, between 1855 and 1867, tremendous amounts of gold were carried because of the gold rush up in the north, in the Yukon and in Alaska. That was the 1848 gold rush. Here is the map of the old Panama Canal Railroad. You can see the dotted line moving down there, all the way down to the Pacific. It's following the Chagres River for the most part. That river was a bane in the builders. What can I say? It just proved to be indomitable. And, well, we'll see the solution to that. And we'll be going into the solution in a couple of days. This is the railroad. It cost more than $8 million. It was unusual. It used these U-shaped rails that you see up there. And just like the canal, the environment took its toll. About 12,000 people died trying to construct it, mostly from disease, and we'll see the disease as I go into the Panama Canal, what it was. And you see the dimensions and the specifications of the railroad up there. It used a non-standard gauge up until 2001. You're looking at the main street there in Colon, which was named after Columbus, and as I mentioned earlier, named after Aspinwall, who began the Panama Canal Railroad. This is what the station looked like before the fire of 1885. Don't bother looking for these remains in Colon. because you won't go into Cologne. It's not a safe place unless you go on an organized tour. But all this stuff has gone. The railroad hospital is something that I've not heard many speakers talk about when they talk about the Panama Canal. There was a railroad hospital there, and one of the ways they made their money, of course they were making money from their patients, but one of the ways they were making money is they were taking the dead people's bodies, pickling them and selling them to medical schools. They used that money then to expand the hospital, and in 1855, the Panama Railroad Company's hospital, the chief doctor there was collecting skeletons to make a library of the racial types that were working on the railroad. And you see an example of one over on the right. In the center there is one of the nurses at the hospital. So some facts about this railroad. In 1913, it was the heaviest used railroad in the world at that time. And you could see how many passengers it carried, almost 3 million, and how many tons of freight it carried, just over 2 million tons of freight. So a busy railroad indeed. All right, now let's move up to the canal, which we'll be doing a partial transit of. Let's backtrack a little bit, because I need to talk about Ferdinand de Lesseps. You may or may not know that he is instrumental in having constructed the Suez Canal, joining the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And it was very successful, although the story of that is quite involved, but that's a story for another cruise and another ship. We're not there. He started in 1859. That was the first blow of the pickaxe in Port Said. And 10 years later, 10 years, the canal is ready to go. Seemed simple, right? 10 years, dig a ditch. That's what he did. And that's what he thought he could do in Panama. Because he'd done it once, why can't he do it again? So this is an idea of what the Panama Canal would look like. It's going to be a sea level canal. Sea level canal in Panama is not going to work. I'll explain why in just a second. And I'll show you the tide heights on the Pacific and the Atlantic side. Now they didn't know that, so they were still going to go ahead and build a sea level. These are the tide heights of Balboa and Cristobal in October of 2019. And as you can see, on the Pacific side, the tide height varies by about 20 feet. And on the Atlantic side, it varies by about 3 or 4 feet. So obviously, if the tide is high on the Pacific side, there's going to be a huge inrush of water on a sea level canal. Anything trying to come out is going to be blown back. It's going to be a real mess. They couldn't do it. You'd have to have some kind of lock system. But no, they didn't know about that. All right, moving ahead into 1889, the company goes bankrupt. He swindled about 800,000 investors. They were ruined. 2,000 workers had died trying to put this together. And in 1892, it was revealed that in fact he had been bribing officials in the government to keep pushing the project forward. In 1893, he's tried, he's convicted and sentenced. It's a big fine and 5 years in jail, but that was annulled by an appeal court due to a statute of limitations. The picture there shows Ferdinand with his wife and some of his children. He was a busy bee. We'll get to that. This is one of the last pictures of Ferdinand that we know of. He died on the 7th of December in 1894, and he was essentially a ruined and destroyed person. Unfortunately, he rose from the heights of being really a successful engineer down to a criminal. Here's some trivia for you. His second wife was 18 years of age when he was 64. And they had 12 children. I said he was a busy bee. He also had 5 from the previous marriage. Now there's a little fact that people don't know, but the Statue of Liberty, when it was delivered to the United States, it was Ferdinand de Lesseps that made the presentation. He was the representative of France that did it. Over on the right there, we're not entirely sure whether this woman is his wife or not, but it seems to me it well could be with one of his kids. This is Gold Hill. We won't be seeing that because we're not going far enough in to the canal this time, but Gold Hill is one of the reasons he was able to get so many people to invest in the Panama Canal, because he claimed it was full of gold. There's nothing in it. except for Earth. In 1894, there was another company that took over after Ferdinand failed, and they carried on, and they realized that they needed a lock system. They realized that the sea level canal isn't going to work. Now, I want you to remember that for when we talk about the USA. The French realized in 1894 they needed a lock system. They started building. The old company has dug out a lot of stuff. I'm not going to read these numbers. You read that. In fact, generally when I give presentations, I don't read what's up on the slide. I'll talk about what's up there, but it's your job to multitask. And my wife informs me the ladies in the audience are much better at it than the men. And you could see the Culebra cut there in 1885 where they had been digging stuff out because they had to move a lot of earth. The SEPs formed this newsletter called the Bulletin, which came out twice a month and extolled the virtues of the construction and the progress that was being made. It was, how shall I put it, an alternative fact. We might see this as we're going in. We're going into the new locks, but as we go in, we might see this. This is the remains of the French canal. It's not very big. It doesn't go very far. And on the other side, it's been filled in. It started off in the Cologne area, but that part's been filled in. But this is still there, and it goes down for about 11 kilometers. They had managed to dig out about 50 meters of earth in the Culebra Cut, and they had created a huge network of diversion channels because the Chagres River, remember I already referred to this, was the bane in their side when it came to creating the canal, because it floods, and it floods every year, and those floods are pretty significant, and they needed to get that water away from the canal. So the French idea was diversion channels. This was when they were still thinking sea level canal in the first company. That's the Lesseps company. It was the second company that really didn't do very much, that realized they needed a lock system. These are some photographs of some of the stuff that was left over by the French. I want you to remember this when I talk about what the USA found, because this is what they found. They bought all this from France, and by the time they got it, it wasn't in great condition, but that's another story. Right, the gold rush. Now, the gold rush is very important in promoting the US getting involved in this, because the gold rush was basically in the United States. It was up in Alaska. It was also in the Yukon, which is in Canada, but people were going up the west coast to get there. So you had some choices. You could walk or ride the 3,000 kilometers it takes to get there. It would take you about 4 to 6 months. You could sail the long route, which is going around down the bottom of South America. That's about 2 to 4 months, depending on how lucky you are. You may not even make it because of the storms, of course, as you're going around Cape Horn. You could sail to Panama, cross overland like the Spanish used to do, pull everything over, then sail up to San Francisco. That took 5 weeks, and that was shorter. Not everybody made it. In fact, only about 10% made it. These are the routes that I talked about with the dimensions in both miles and kilometers that you can see. And obviously it's better to go the short route, right? Or would you like to go the long route? No, okay, good, just checking. This is the Panama route, potentially cut up almost 13,000 kilometers and months of travel. Now the problem is, because so many people were doing it, there wasn't that many ships going up from Panama City to the west coast of America, so you're stuck in this hot, humid environment, subject to disease, and disease is yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and cholera, all nice, happy diseases, and of course rotten food, because in the conditions that they weren't used to these conditions, food didn't stay fresh very long, so they would end up with rotten food. So this is where a lot of people would meet their fate, or they would give up at this point and go back. So the next attempt, in 1899, the US is considering building a canal across Nicaragua. Remember, we've got all those surveys already that says Nicaragua is the best way to go. In 1901, McKinley, who decides, obviously, is assassinated, and we have Roosevelt coming into office. The French lobbied very hard with Roosevelt because obviously they want to try and get some money back. They've done some work, they pushed it, go the Panama route. We've done all this preliminary work for you. You don't have to go with Nicaragua. Nicaragua is not safe. It's even on the stamps here that Nicaragua is not safe. There's a volcano erupting. There's a volcano erupting, and there's another one on the stamp. So don't go that way because you'll get blown up by a volcano. Well, he fell for it, and they chose the Panama route. So they bought from France for 40 million, which is a lot of money in those days. Maybe it doesn't sound so much today, but it was a lot of money then. And the land. So the country at that point, you see there, Colombia owns Panama. Nova Granada has become Colombia, and that owns it. And that was the largest real estate history until that point. Now, when the US was dealing with Colombia, unfortunately, the Colombians, at least in the US opinion, did not deal in good faith. And we have some newspaper clippings there saying that. They wanted more money after they realized what was going on. And the USA didn't particularly want to pay more money, so they actually considered an invasion of that area. There is some background politics here that we're not going into, but you can imagine who started this rebellion. It was US promoted, and on the 3rd of November in 1903, rebels seized the isthmus, and the US just happened to have a gunship in the area to help them out. It was pretty bloodless. The only casualties was a foreign-born shopkeeper and a donkey. I feel sorry for the donkey. And very quickly, these other gunships just sort of ended up in Panamanian waters, as if to say, well, maybe you don't really want to fight because we're supporting the rebels. And indeed, that's what happened. So recognition on November the 13th, formally, 1903, the Republic of Panama was recognized, a new country was created, Colombia lost that. France, of course, did it the next day. They had a vested interest in supporting the USA, and they did so. And 15 other countries very quickly followed suit, probably with encouragement from both France and the USA politically. So the treaty that was formed between the government of Panama, the fledgling government, created this treaty area, the red line there, which was US sovereign territory. It was a zone 16 kilometers wide and went from coast to coast. It was actually bigger than they had originally bargained for with the government. So the Panamanians realized that they'd been hoodwinked. And of course, the newspapers reflect this too. And the USA had done a good deal, at least from the US point of view, not from the Panamanian point of view. That was in the small print. And in fact, worldwide, US reputation did suffer somewhat. Some of these cartoons here are reflecting that. And this one here, we'll talk about this in a minute, that says the man who could make the dirt fly. That was Roosevelt's idea. Let's make the dirt fly. And he passed that on to his first engineer. This is the first commission of the Panama Canal, the Panama Canal Commission. There were 3 of them. These are the individuals in the first one. And you can imagine running a big engineering project by committee is perhaps not the best way to do it. And indeed, when we get to part 2, you'll see what the best way to do it actually was, although these committees still existed. Where you see a couple of figures that have the second on them, here and here, then those individuals carried over into the second Panama Canal Committee. And they've issued some very fine reports, gives you some great history. They hadn't settled on a route. Where you see a black line up here, so for example, there's a black line there, there's another one, and there's another one. Each one of these black lines you see was considered as a route through. In fact, there's even one there, a dotted one, that was considered as a route. This is the second commission, and where you see firsts on the individuals' faces, they are the carryover from the first committee. So this is the second committee, and then there's another one that was appointed in 1906. It didn't improve anything, as you'll see when we get to some of the problems that the chief engineers ran into dealing with this committee back home. So the first chief engineer is John Findlay Wallace, and in 1904 he's placed in charge of the operations. He's got tons of French equipment. Remember the pictures I showed you? And they all needed repair. They weren't in great condition. He had a small workforce. There was a few people left over there. He had 3,500 men. He recruited 1,500 new people. The rest were there from the French effort. One of these individuals holds a very special place in history, but you have to wait for part 2 for that one. And make the dirt fly. Well, that's what Wallace is told by the president. Make the dirt fly. And that's what he attempts to do. Now, unfortunately, he knew that it wasn't a very nice area to live in. There was disease there. It was a dangerous area. And so he was prepared. He brought 2 coffins. One for him, one for his wife. What do you think that did to morale of the workforce? It wasn't good. Now, there are some pictures here that you see of the cemeteries, and yes, indeed, these are people that died working on the Panama Canal. We'll talk about that a little later. And over at the top there, you'll see coffins at the railroad station for all the people that did indeed. They died like flies. They did indeed die like flies. It was awful. Very, very nasty. So this is the plan. They're going to build a sea-level canal from Colon all the way down to Panama City, following the red line. It's following the Chagres River, the one that floods and causes problems. That's what they're going to do. So they started, and they start in the middle in Culebra, 1904 in November. This is the kind of equipment they're using. This is one of the Bucyrus steam shovels. It can lift huge amounts of earth in one big scoop. You can see how big the bucket is compared to the men there. You see the man next to the bucket's bigger than the man. Unfortunately, the geology of this area is such that the earth isn't stable. In fact, I have a separate talk about Panama Canal tectonics, which I'm actually not doing on this voyage. We don't have enough time to do it all. But it is the tectonics in this region that is peculiar and causes things like this. So we have landslides, we have earth moving, and the tracks that they're laying down aren't stable. And you get that. So making the dirt fly was actually a disastrous approach to this engineering project, which is what they're trying to do here. You see the cars up there, the dirt's put into that and they're taken away somewhere. We'll talk about where that goes in part 2. And you can see the conditions that these men are working in. 3 weeks after starting, this is in 1904, yellow fever strikes the workforce. 3 men contract yellow fever. They're in this picture. Some of you may know what yellow fever is, some of you may not. We'll get into that and how it was solved. 6 more by December. And most people who got it and who ended up in hospital like this didn't get out. It killed a lot of people. Now, it was due to, most of the deaths are due to malaria and yellow fever. They didn't know at this time that mosquitoes carried the disease. They thought the disease was due to crawling bugs or maybe miasma, which is bad air from the swamp, because it stank, right? They're working in swamp there. They tried to protect themselves against the wrong source. They had no idea that it was these little creatures carrying the viruses or bacteria. So one of the things that they would do to stop bugs crawling up into their beds was to put pools of water around the legs of their beds. Now, where do mosquitoes like to breed? In standing water. So they made the problem even worse, unfortunately. The mosquito that is responsible for carrying the disease is the one shown up on the right, Aedes aegypti, not the one on the left, Anopheles gambia, it's not that one. And you can see how widespread aegypti is in 2015. The probability of occurrence is 1, where it's red on that map. So it's all over the world. What is yellow fever? It is caused by something called a flavivirus, which is shown on the top right. Your symptoms that you get, say, 3 to 6 days afterwards, it may be just like flu and you might get over it. If you go into the acute phase, I've listed the symptoms there. You can then go into the toxic phase, and I've listed the symptoms there, and also the percentages of people that will not survive. As you can see, it's not great. You can roll the dice and you're anywhere from about 3% to 7.5% to survive if you get yellow fever. That's not really the odds that I particularly like. There at the time was no treatment whatsoever for yellow fever. You got it, you survived, or you didn't. Maybe they could make you comfortable on the way out. After 3 months, 500 Americans leave. Here they are fleeing. Don't blame them, really. People dying like flies, and they don't really know what's causing it. By June of 1905, 75% of them had left the isthmus. This is Colon, and it looks kind of deserted because, yes, they'd all gone. They didn't want to stay there. Unfortunately, most of the deaths of the people that did work on the canal are the West Indians. This is a West Indian cemetery, and they're just in the process of finishing a burial in this photograph. Now along comes Colonel Gorgas, June 1904. He has the benefit of being immune to yellow fever because he had it. If you have it and survive, you're immune to it. I don't recommend you go out and get it so you can get immunity. Don't want to roll that dice. He knew what the cause was. He knew it was carried by mosquitoes. It's just they didn't know in Panama at the time, but he did. He now becomes the chief medical officer in the engineering project. He's got 2 urban areas separated by jungle and swamp, huge area that is a breeding ground for the disease. He's got to clean it up. So he figures he needs $1 million at the time to be able to do this. So what do you think he got? Well, it's up there. 1904, he gets 50,000. Helpful, right? In 1905, after lots of people died, it was finally approved. The original plan that he submitted to the Panama Canal Commission and the government in the United States was referred to as the various balderdash, and comments flew like, let's fire the mad physician, because we can't possibly give him that amount of money. Of course, he was right. It was the most expensive at that time public health campaign. And what you see in these photographs here is fumigation and cleanup of standing water. They would fumigate areas using sulfur. They would coat water with oil to prevent mosquitoes breeding in standing water. And they'd have to do this everywhere. They would do all the housing. They would have to do the whole area from urban to urban development and everything in between. This is the fumigation brigade. You can see in 1905, it started at about 200 men. It was eventually as many as 2,000 that were working on killing the mosquitoes and stopping this disease. Here's some pictures of how they did it. Over on the left, they're spreading oil through that dispenser. Over on the right, the individual has got an oil can on his back and he's spraying a ditch that's got standing water in it. Again, more pictures of cleaning up every water source where a mosquito might breed. You got to clean this up. Can you imagine this? In the heat. It got to the point where they had a local law that if they found a mosquito larva, you were fined. So everybody had to partake in trying to make sure there was no standing water anywhere. Everything had to be treated. No standing water allowed. August 1906, he had cut the cases by half. By September, he got it down to 7 cases. November the 11th, 1906, this is the last death from Panama Canal, from yellow fever. He had saved thousands of lives through this public health campaign that he embarked on, cleaning up all the standing water, killing all the mosquitoes, trying to prevent their breeding. What did he use? I've listed some of the equipment that he used here on this slide. I'm not going to read that out to you, but you could see very large quantities of material indeed were used. Just let me highlight one there, 600,000 gallons of oil spread everywhere to prevent the larva breeding in the standing water. 1905, he gets money to screen in buildings, porches, windows. $90,000 is a lot of money in 1905. And it's estimated that he saved over 70,000 lives, and some 40 million days of sickness were eliminated through his public health campaign. This shows you the admission rates among Canada employees on the canal from 1906 all the way up to 1953. And it's the rate per 1,000, and you can see the height of the bar there drops dramatically. By 1915, it's dropped basically to what it stayed at for the rest of the period. All this data comes from a source known as the Canal record. We'll talk about that a bit later too. This is all his work. Right, let's get back to the chief engineer. Remember, there are commissions back in Washington that oversee everything. And the red tape, absolutely awful. It really wore this man down. He was also terrified of disease there, so he was forever trying to go back to Washington and basically pretend to have a meeting so he's not in Panama. So for an example, to hire a handcart for an hour, it took 6 different vouchers. The paperwork just horrible. And you can see how much paper was involved in the payroll there. Again, I'm not reading that out. Delay, delay, delay. Because it was so difficult to get stuff, they started to order things in large quantities, so the delay kind of got eliminated. And sometimes it got messed up. So for example there, 12,000 doors came with 240,000 hinges. Somebody back in America made a mistake there. Who knows? So during that panic evacuation that we spoke about a little bit earlier, Wallace goes back to Washington again. He's basically running away just like the rest of them. Taft, who's the secretary at the time, demands that Wallace resigns, and he does. And that's it. That's the 25th of June 1905, and Wallace is out. What do? They now find someone else who can build things. This is John Stevens. And he was very successful at building railroads. He realized what the big problem was. The big problem was make the dirt fly. His first job when he gets to Panama is to stop digging, which is 26th of July 1905. Up until that time we had spent, well, the USA had spent 78 million under Wallace in trying to build a sea level canal. I keep saying that because that's important. All right, that's basically the end of part 1. Some facts now. That's me standing in the rain, because when it rains here, it really rains, and I decided to experience this rain. It ruined my shoes completely, by the way, because they were so waterlogged. And I did it specifically because these men that worked here worked in this kind of weather many days in the year, and I wanted to feel what it was like. And oh gosh, I can't imagine, even though I was standing in that rain, in the heat and the humidity, what they did. to build that canal. There were 3 presidents that oversaw the construction of the canal. You might think it's only Roosevelt, but it wasn't. It was also Taft and Wilson. And it is in fact Wilson that opens the canal, but we'll see that later. This is rainfall and temperature. This is out of the canal record, 1905. The bars there are showing you the rainfall in millimeters. So the tallest one there in July, which is there, is 19.7 inches, 500 millimeters. And above it, the red line is showing you the temperatures in that area. And it's topping out at 55 degrees centigrade, 132 degrees Fahrenheit. They're working in this. None of your safety rules that we got today. Excuse me, it's too hot, I want to stop working. No, get on with it. There's a snapshot, 1907, of various causes of death. Accident, dysentery, malaria, all the way down to a total of 1,273 people who died. Over on the right, it's broken down by racial type, and the total is 3,670. Why don't those numbers match up? I don't expect an answer to that. I'm going to tell you. It's because if you were sick, you were taken off the payroll. So the number on the right is everybody that died. The number on the left is the people who died while they were on payroll. Make the earth fly. This is data from the canal record again. So we're looking at how much earth was moved as we're going across from May all the way out to December 1913. And you could see when Stevens arrived, not much had been done. And then Stevens gets a lot done, but not enough. And then Goethel arrives, that's for part 2. And that's where most of the work is done. And then finally it's opened up. So that's how much earth finally got moved. That's in cubic yards, by the way. This is the transit history. And you can see the transit there, the number of transits in the dark line, the tonnage in the light blue line, and you can see the tonnage exceeds the number of transits once the new locks have opened, because the new locks can take heavier ships. We'll talk about that in part 2. And that brings me to the end of part 1. You have got time to go grab a cup of coffee and then get back here for part 2 in 15 minutes or so. Thank you.